I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and next to me is a Mazda CX-60. When the CX-60 first came out last year, its ride quality was not acceptable, its body control was not acceptable, its transmission calibration was not acceptable. It took a bit of time, but Mazda itself has now acknowledged these faults. And it's taken the bold step of making a significant running change to the suspension and the transmission of the CX-60, both the hardware and, in the case of the transmission, also the software. At the production line for new builds, while customers who took delivery of early CX-60s are eligible for a free upgrade at their dealer where their suspension hardware will be swapped out and the car will also have a software update. These sorts of running changes happen from time to time, but they're not usually this significant. And it is a response to the criticism the CX-60 received on launch, including from this outlet. Because if you're a subscriber, you'll know that I ran a dark blue CX-60 diesel for 6 months and found that these faults meant the car was impossible to recommend. Now the upgrade is ready, and the white CX-60 Azami SP diesel 6-cylinder next to me is identical to my long-termer, except for the paint color and the fact that it has the upgraded suspension and transmission. This video has a simple premise. Have the upgrades worked? Let's find out. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. But we can't film this video at our test track, at least not the actual driving commentary, because while it's a great facility, it is very smooth. And for this video, we need bumps, because bumps were what were upsetting the Mazda CX-60. Well, that and bad transmission calibration. And in this video, I'm going to be addressing whether or not those things have been fixed by the emergency running change that's been made to the CX-60 in response to criticism of these two factors. Criticism which included our long-term review, which was pretty forceful. If you're a subscriber, you will have seen my comments about the CX-60, good and bad, after living with one in a very similar specification to this for 6 months. And if you want to know my thoughts about the interior and the price and other factors of the vehicle, some of which are very good points, make sure you look at that long-term review of the Blue Beast. But today we're in a white car which is otherwise identical in spec to my long-termer. It's a diesel 6-cylinder Azami SP, except that this vehicle has the new suspension hardware, it's got the new suspension software, and it's got the new transmission software as well. And I'm pleased to report that the changes have partially worked. Thank goodness, because this program would not have been cheap for Mazda. For a car company to not only make a sudden change at the production line level to all new suspension hardware, which would of course have had to have been tested at the proving ground and then put into production, that's expensive. But Mazda is even going as far as offering the hardware change and the software update to owners of vehicles which were already on the road. That was basically CX-60s built in the first 6 months of production. Now, we don't usually see stuff like this happening, and it is of course a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that this car was not right from when production started. Now, often, the first year of cars, we generally, suggest avoiding the first year. The teething problems have to be ironed out, but this was a big teething problem. So, what was the problem? To summarize, the car felt like the front and the rear axles weren't talking to each other in terms of the damping. It felt over-damped and really stiff at the front end, and under-damped, poorly disciplined and lacking control at the rear end, which was unpleasant on normal roads while commuting and really, really awful and noticeable on bumpy country roads, just like the one we're driving on today, which if you're from Sydney, you might know this road. It's the one that runs down to Akuna Bay. Nice road, speed limit isn't too high, a lot of people like to tour on this road, but it's really poorly surfaced with no sign of improvements on the way, so perfect for our purposes today. What has Mazda done? Well, on the suspension front, it's a pretty significant change because the hardware has been swapped out. Completely different shock absorber, and there's also a different tune on the suspension. Mazda's gone back and revisited the tune. They say they've only mentioned the rear tune, but the front also feels like it's had a little bit of a retune as well, although it wasn't as problematic at the front end. Then there's also new software in terms of transmission calibration. And you know what? It has largely worked. I'm not going to go out and tell you that everything is perfectly fixed, everything is perfectly good, and the CX-60 rides as well as, say, a BMW X3 on adaptive dampers. but it is noticeably better than before. I'm going to go ahead and call it about a 40% improvement in the ride situation. Now, it's still firm, it's still quite sporty, which I think is Mazda's intention for the CX-60. This car isn't meant to be soft and floppy, and I've read a few media reports suggesting that the change was intended to make it softer. I don't think that's true. I think that firm, plenty of road feel sort of attitude is what Mazda wants for its vehicles, including the CX-60. Instead of making it softer, what the change has done is to make the CX-60's ride more disciplined, and in particular, the body control improvement is very noticeable. Over the worst of bumps, where the body vertically pitches up and down, you still do feel a little bit too much float from the rear end, and things can still jump around a little bit in the boot if they're not tied down, but it is considerably less so than before, and that's really on the worst bumps. On the sort of standard bumpy, poorly surfaced country roads, the whole experience is much more pleasant, much more comfortable, much more settled. There are still cars in the class which are better. I mentioned the X3 on adaptive. I also think the Volkswagen Touareg on air suspension, for instance, is better than this car, but it's a damn sight better than what was coming out of the factory at the start, and that's good. As I mentioned, there are still some moments where the rear end feels like it's not tied down enough and still not perfectly in sync with the relatively crisp, relatively well-damped front end. I think the front is maybe not quite as overdamped as it was before. The rear is still a little bit underdamped, but less so than before. You might even be able to notice in this PTC a little bit of that sort of head toss, vertical motions, a little, especially there, exactly illustrating my point. The vertical motion is a little bit exaggerated, but definitely less so than before. So I'm going to go ahead and call it a 40% improvement in terms of ride. It's now at the point where it's not a factor that would have me recommend that you simply don't buy this car, which is where I was at with it before. I now think it's worth test driving, but if possible, try and get a CX-60 test drive overnight so you can see whether the firm ride actually reflects the characteristics that you want from a premium SUV. But now I'm going to go ahead and say that it's definitely livable. The better news comes on the transmission front. The transmission was really bizarre in terms of its calibration from factory across all of the powertrains, but especially the diesel and the plug-in hybrid, which I haven't tested after it received the same upgrades. Just like for like with my long-term tester, which was diesel like this car, the transmission is night and day different. It is much better than it was before the update. It used to do really weird stuff. It sounded like slipping clutch effect, even though that shouldn't be happening on this particular type of automatic. It kind of sounded like a bus, like a weird single clutch automatic. Now it honestly does a good simulation of a torque converter automatic, which is exactly what I want from an auto in a vehicle like this. You just don't want to think about it. Pulling away here, shifting crisply, nothing to remark, just working like a normal auto. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Mazda have solved the transmission issues with the software update that they've done for this car, at least on the diesel. Though I think to draw a final line under all of this recent unpleasantness about the CX-60, we probably do need to test the petrol and also the plug-in hybrid. The plug-in hybrid was the one that suffered the worst, particularly in the ride department. But when it comes to the diesel, the ride is better, the transmission's fixed. Good to see Mazda at least getting out on the front foot and addressing these problems, even if I think a big established car manufacturer like Mazda has been doing this for a long time. They should have got this stuff right the first time. But you know what? At least they're addressing it now. So the summary of my findings. I've said that there's a 40% improvement in the overall ride of the CX-60, both the ride quality and especially the body control. It now moves the CX-60 from really quite unpleasant to drive on a bumpy road to acceptable. It's still not the most plush or the best rounded vehicle in the segment, but I think I could live with it. And I think if you actually like quite a lot of road feel and firmness, you will like the CX-60. And the fact that it's no longer bucking crazily over multiple bumps means that the suspension is now okay. I could certainly live with it. And the transmission, well, as far as I'm concerned, on the diesel, that's fixed. So that is definitely a win. The CX-60 wasn't able to be considered in my estimation before now, but the upgrade has made it acceptable. And that goes to show Mazda has realized the error, have largely corrected the error, and that should be celebrated. But I think it's also a moment to reflect on the importance of independent road testing. That's what we do here at Chasing Cars. We're powered by Budget Direct, which means that we can give you our straight opinion about the vehicles that we test. Good, bad, unvarnished. We called out this car for not being good enough. Our criticism was joined by others. Mazda have largely fixed the problem. That's the way road testing should work. That's what we do here at Chasing Cars.